Hello, hello. The display property. We're revisiting it. We're talking about it. And it is very important, which is why we're revisiting it. So let's go into this. I'm not gonna go through everything I wrote here. You can read that. But in this video, I just want to talk about the display property and these various specific display properties that we have, like inline block, flex, table. So let's get into it. I'm going to go ahead and copy that. I'm going to copy that and I'm going to go into the sandbox. I must have been doing something else in here, so I'm going to, I've got a paragraph there. That's kind of nice. I'm just going to keep whatever I have going in there, and I'm going to replace these. All right, great. Format that. Cool. So I just added a few things in there. We don't need that. We've got a div here. So we've got a paragraph. All right. Let's format. Cool. So we've got H1 here, and let's give some backgrounds. Let's say H1, you get a line background. Not backwards, background line. And P, we have multiple P tags here. So let's say dot lime and dot blue. Just gonna give the blue things color white, so you're gonna have class blue, and this little class lime. So we need to be able to see sort of the outline. We need to see exactly what the width of these things are. Got blue, lime, and let's go with, for this one, 7. Okay, so we've got some different colors here. Now let's go through this. H1 and P, both of these tags have a default display property, and that default is block. So if I add to this one the class block, guess what? Nothing changes. It's entirely the same because that's the default. So everything has some CSS by default, and it's usually helpful to know what it is. You don't have to know all the CSS that's always getting applied, and it'll be different on different browsers, on different systems. So if you're looking at something on a mobile phone on iOS, it might look different than on your browser on a Windows machine, and that's all fine. But some of the properties are consistent and they're pretty important, such as display. So display block is saying a few things, and this is part of why CSS can be so confusing, because some of the properties do multiple things. Display is one of those properties. It's saying, I want you to have a width of 100%. You can see all of these items take up the full width of the page. Full width. And it's also saying, I don't want anything else on the same row. To show you what I mean, let's take these P tags and say, I want all P tags inline block. And you'll see some things changed, but you're still getting everything on the same line. So we've got, let's see what we got here. Let's take it away real quick. Okay. So this is to show you that some things are happening. Again, why display is confusing. Display inline block says be as wide as you have to be. It doesn't have 100%. It has just as much as possible. So we can say with 100, not 200, 100%. And again, we're getting something fairly familiar here. But just by changing the display property, we change the width. Furthermore, we're getting more weird behavior, or more non-obvious behavior. And that, look at the margins, the spacing. I know that there's a margin there, but visually it's just spacing. how come saying inline block gives me more space between elements? It's confusing, and the reason, I'll tell you the reason, but the larger point is that CSS will be confusing, and don't try to memorize everything right off the bat. Just know that when things don't make sense, there is going to be a reason, even if you don't know it. And once you do, it'll all make sense again. But it can be fairly frustrating to see all your styles change at once for no apparent reason. So the reason here is that p tags have some margin by default. Let's even remove this. So our p tags don't have any, they have all default styling now. And you'll notice there's space. There's space between them to prove to you that it's actually a margin. Say margin 0. And now there's no space. And now there's space again. So by default, p tags have some margin. The same is true for h1. You'll see there's space up there. Now, now there's still space, but there is less of it, right? So in a lesson on margins, we talk about how margins will collapse. Let's bring, if we say margin 0 again here, now we really have no margins. But p tags have margins on the top and the bottom by default, which is why even when the h1 has no margin here, there's still some spacing because it's coming from the p tag. Let's remove that. So there's another a quirk of the display property, at least inline block, says your margins no longer collapse. So what that means is if we have, I don't know what the exact value is by default, let's just say margin top 20 pixels and margin bottom 20 pixels. And so now I know what the value is, and I'll remove that, bring it back. Yep. So what's happening now is that we have about 40 pixels of space with inline block. And that's going to get about halved if we comment it out again. Yep, you can see on the top one. The bottom one no longer makes sense. But you see up here, it looks about halfway, right? Halfway. Or not drawing. Halfway. Okay. And so when you have inline blocks, the margins don't collapse, right? What? Yeah, it is just the way of CSS. So, but again, I don't want to try to make you think that you have to remember all these things by default. It's just that the display property does a lot. So let's keep on going. We've got some inline blocks, and the other thing about inline blocks is they wrap. So if I make this, they wrap if they can. See that? Now we have things on the same line. So I deleted a whole bunch of text, and that means that the second p tag is slim enough that it doesn't have room on screen to just wrap with everything else that's in line around it. And if we take that away again, you'll see that now it's full width and they don't wrap. You don't get anything on the same line, even though there's not much text in either of the p tags. Okay, let's bring it back. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and remove that. All right, let's keep on going. There's this other one called table. I'm going to talk about table. Table is one that you won't use often. At least I haven't used it often, and I've built quite a lot of things online. You'll probably not need it, but it has this one odd use case, which backs up my statement that the display property is strange. And that is, if you want something to act like a block element, but you don't want it to take up, you want it to take up as much width as necessary, not 100% width. So by default, h1 with 100%. So this is default. I'm just bringing this in to show you that nothing changes. But now I need to take that away, and let's go in here and we'll say class table, and look at that. What happened there? So we notice something that, let's say inline block, and what I want to illustrate is that, let's just say we have a bunch of inline blocks. Inline block. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is, let's say the P's are also inline block. They start wrapping, and you'll see them. What I mean by that is it goes up on the same line, it goes next to it, and that's because they are both inline block. And when you inline block also says only be as wide as you need to be. But with table, now they don't wrap. There's no wrapping, but also it doesn't get 100% width. It gets as much width as is necessary. See, it just gets wider as it needs to be. And if we have block in here, which again is the default, it's going to be 100% width. So table has this odd property where it says to whatever has table styling to be as wide as you need to be, but no wider. What that in turn lets us do is it lets us, we can use it to center things, margin 0, auto. And that works because if you have display block, you already have 100% width, so you're not going to center anything. Since this is an H1, we can, of course, do text align center, and we'll get a similar effect. But compare that to this. Zero auto, and bring table back, table. So before we had what'll happen if I say width 100%. And I'm going to put it on the same line because then I can comment it out at the same time. So here's the difference, is one of these, it's only as wide as it needs to be. So we can use things like background and border and padding. One pixel solid, salmon's not obvious, blue, let's go blue. Look at that, hey. Let's go 5 pixels. And this again. So you may be thinking that these are very similar, and you're right. But this is the beauty of CSS, and part of why it is fairly complex is that there's a lot going on here. You can style things any way you want. And part of that means that there's a lot of complexity involved, but also there's a lot of flexibility. So if you're a designer, you're likely instantly seeing the difference here, that sometimes you want one or the other. Sometimes you want 100% width and you can style things that way, and sometimes you want an element to just be as wide as it needs to be. So this is what the table property is useful for. And you can use it for other things, but based on years and years of writing this type of code, I'm going to tell you probably won't need it. And if you do, you still probably don't. There's actually probably a better way to do whatever you want to do with table styling. All right, let's remove that. Okay, so the other important one is flexbox. So we've covered block, inline block, table, and then there's this display flex. And this is such it's a flexible, I mean that figuratively, it's a very flexible property because it lets you style all sorts of things all sorts of ways. And like many of these, it can be somewhat confusing to use. The thing about flex is it deals with parent-child relationships. So you usually don't just style one thing, display flex. You style something display flex, and then all of its children elements will be styled a certain way. So let's go in here. I'm going to make a div. So now we have a div outside here. We can say salmon class, just to show you there's a div outside. Yeah, that doesn't show you that well, but let's say, what do we want to give it? Well, I'm going to just give it its own class and we'll style it. Background is wheat. All right. So now we've got a nice wheat background there. We can give it a bit of padding just to show you there's stuff inside this div. All right, now let's give this main div, let's give it the flex. And whoa, that was odd, right? How weird is that? Everything goes into a row. And yes, that is actually exactly what you'd expect. Flex, by default, if you give something flex, all of its children suddenly line up. No matter what, these all have their whatever display property they had. H1 has display table right now. These p tags have display block by default. and they're still going to show up in a line. Very, very odd, right? Very interesting. And that's what Flex does. It lets you, this is just the beginning of what it does, but one thing it can do is it can take a bunch of elements displayed however, and it'll just put them in a row for you. Another thing it can do is, let's go main. So we actually want to change Flexbox. And when I say Flexbox, I'm referring generally to the concept, not one specific property. There's another property called Flex Direction. I'm going to say column. And now you'll see that we're getting things similar to before. Well, let's keep on going. Let's say main, you're going to have more height. We're going to say height is going to be 100 VH. I'm just going to make it pretty tall. 100 VH means 100% of the window, the visual height, or the visual height. So now it's pretty tall. And what if we wanted things in here to kind of stretch out and fill or do different things? We can say, let's start with another property. This is part of Flexbox. Justify content space between. And look at that. Now we have everything moving up and down to put as much space as possible between these elements. We can also say space around, and they kind of distribute themselves nicely. We can say flex start, surprise, surprise, no change. That's actually the default. And say flex end, and now they'll jump down there to the bottom. So this is ultimately just a preview, because Flexbox can go a lot deeper, and so we're going to get into it more outside of this specific lesson. But it lets you do a bunch of interesting things. To sort of generalize, it lets you treat all the child elements sort of like you would treat text. Like we can say center, we can move things to the center, we can say flex end, which is moving things all the way to the end. And in the world of text, this might be like text align right and center. We can do what you already saw, space around, space between. So Flexbox lets us do a lot of things that would be normally sort of hard to do. It's very useful for mobile screens, for instance, because you never know how large a phone is going to be. There's so many sizes of phone these days that when you're writing CSS for a phone, you generally want it to be flexible CSS. Flexible in that it'll work for all sorts of different screen sizes. You often want to say, all right, every element inside this div, just arrange yourself so that there's as much space as possible between you, like the space between. And as much space as possible means it's going to depend on the screen size. But your CSS can be written in such a way that it'll look good regardless of screen size. Or maybe there are some phones that are just a very odd screen size and it's going to look terrible. But in general, you can make layouts that we would call constraint-based. You're constraining the layout to certain proportions, to have certain properties in certain circumstances. All right, there is a bit of a preview of Flexbox along with the main details that I wanted to cover about block, inline block, and table. I'll see you in the next lesson.